As video games continue to integrate themselves further and further into our culture, numerous studies focus on the effect that they have on our bodies and brains. Do video games make us more violent? Will staring at a screen all day rot your brain? Does the portrayal of women in video games impact female body image? These are all age-old questions that many have sought to answer, though an important link often goes ignored in the process: the connection between body and game in video game experience, or how physical senses and movements can control or impact aspects of the simulated world a gamer finds himself in. Crozier writes in his book, A Cultural History of the Human Body in the Modern Age, that bodies become apparent through use, and that if we want to study them, we have to consider them in action. In this video, we will be exploring the way that video games have evolved from their analog, button-and-switch beginnings to bodily experiences that take into account all five senses, in the hopes of, as he outlines, considering bodies in action as a means of furthering our understanding of them. In a world that places so much emphasis and value in athletic achievement, why would video games, a genre of entertainment that, in many's perspective, exists in a completely different world than sports, advance in a way that blurs the line between player and controller? To answer this, let's first take a look at how video games began and how they evolved. Both gamers and scholars of game studies disagree on what exactly the first video game is, since the definition of what a video game is at all can be a contentious issue alone. If we consider them to be interactive electronic games, the first video game was probably the excitingly titled Cathode Ray Tube Amusement Device, which used an electronic screen meant to represent a World War II radar, and whose gameplay involved the simulation of an artillery shell en route to its target. Controls included the titular cathode ray tube itself alongside oscilloscope-type circuitry that had a set of knobs and switches, a far cry from the controllers of today. 10 years after the cathode ray tube amusement device was granted a patent for its design, which would never see production past the prototype stage, physicist William Higginbotham had finished production of Tennis for Two, a game generally considered to be the first actual video game, made with the goal of presenting an interactive demonstration on how scientific endeavors have relevance on society. Tennis for Two was exactly what it sounds like, a simulated tennis game for two players that involved the usage of knobs and buttons on a 5-inch diameter screen. Higginbotham and other scientists at Brookhaven National Laboratory— why did I say it like I'm a British person? Higginbotham and other scientists at Brookhaven National Laboratory were shocked by the popularity the game immediately generated, with spectators supposedly, quote, lining up to get a chance at virtually hitting a ball back and forth. With that being said, it is perhaps no surprise that the following decades set the tone for the popularity video games have today, where 54.2% of the US population are digital gamers, with 48% of them playing primarily on mobile devices. But before video games could reach our phones, they had to first move from gigantic computers and oscilloscopes to the home computer, which was quickly becoming smaller and faster with every passing year. In 1962, the digital computer game Space War broke away from the trend of video games as academic research tools by marketing itself purely as a means of entertainment. Though it originally included front panel test switches on the mini computer itself, Space War's developers would actually engineer a detached control device, essentially a controller, that established a disconnect between the device and player for the first time. This was furthered by the introduction of home consoles in the 1970s, beginning with the 1972 Magnavox Odyssey and continuing with the more well-known titles like the Atari VCS in 1977 and the Sega Master System in 1985. These devices brought the game away from the research lab or mall arcade and into the player's home, a model that dominates the market today. 1970 generally marks the beginning of the commercial video game industry, as from there, video games rapidly expanded and innovated beyond the simple 8-bit games of the genre's genesis. Buttons and switches moved from devices themselves to controllers, and games themselves became more narrative and character-driven, no longer lines and circles existing in an analog background. In response to the ravenous demand for them, video games emerged at the end of the 20th century as an interactive experience that could be produced from the comfort of one's own couch. At this point, video games were still very much a bodily experience, though in a way that differs from the more holistic approach we see now. The usage of things like mice, keyboards, controllers, and switches still required a degree of control and hand-eye coordination. Staring at a screen and concentrating for extended periods of time required endurance and patience. Video games were undeniably a physical experience occurring on a digital screen. Buttons and keyboards and mice haven't gone anywhere, but now, after decades of technological advancement, video games have found ways to bring the whole body into the electronic world. This is accomplished in a number number of ways, but first, we will be looking at the most obvious, the usage of body movement in game input. Thinking about the whole body's usage in video games brings forth the obvious image of dancing games like Dance Dance Revolution, an arcade game that eventually found its way into homes, or Just Dance, released in 2009, which got its players up and off the couches that had quickly become synonymous with video gaming. Capitalizing off the motion capturing controllers that came with the Nintendo Wii, games like Wii Sports, included in the purchase of any Wii console in 2006, simulated the sports of golf, boxing, bowling, tennis, and baseball through movements that mirrored actual sports procedures, such as swinging a tennis racket or bowling a bowling ball. Meant to demonstrate the motion capturing capabilities of the Wii Remote, Wii Sports would become a classic in the world of video games, as it currently stands as the best-selling single-platform game of all time, and the 4th best-selling game overall. The capture of body's movement in games would be expanded in 2010 by the invention of Microsoft's Kinect, a motion capturing device that claimed to be able to sense things like gestures, speech, and, of course, body movement. Kinect Adventures, Microsoft's less popular response to Wii Sports, would still go on to be one of the most popular games of all time, and advertise itself as using full body motion to simulate experiences like floating down a river, traversing an obstacle course, and popping bubbles. In a world that has put emphasis on bodily performance, beginning with the ancient Olympics, it makes sense that video games would seek to mirror the sports and movements that dominate popular entertainment. But bodies aren't just our muscles and bones, and video games have found other ways to expand from the traditional hand and eye coordinated interfaces into those more inclusive of other senses. Most games require some combination of tactile, visual, and auditory cues. You touch the controller, you look at the screen, you hear the sounds and the music. But some games build their premises around these bodily phenomena, like Scream Go Hero, a platformer that requires audio input to move the character forward. Some horror games monitor audio input through a microphone, screaming, sure, when applicable, but also breathing, which simulates tense scenarios. In the visual world, eye trackers bring something as simple as the movement of one's irises as a method of inputting commands, which, when mapped onto things like camera control, lets your head and eyes dictate what it is your player model is experiencing. In open-world games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, this increases the immersion into the open world, while in games like Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is exactly what it sounds like, take eye tracking into account to make the experience as realistic as possible, engaging performance. But what about taste and smell? Can video games incorporate those? The short answer is not yet, though in 2021, Sony filed a patent detailing technology that would incorporate olfactory and gustatory outputs in their PlayStation video games. So far, nothing has hit the shelves that can replicate taste and smells in video game environments, but as with most technology, it's only a matter of time. Rounding out my section titled Senses and Balance is, of course, balance. Not necessarily one of the 5 senses, but still an important facet in bodily experience, and likewise something explored in video game controls. Though bodily movement trackers take this into account to some degree, perhaps no game but Wii Fit can be used to talk about balance in video games. Introduced in 2007, the balance board uses pressure sensors that measure body weight and center of balance as an addition to the already revolutionary motion capturing capabilities of Wii controllers themselves. Through games that included things like yoga, exercise, meditation, balance, and above all else, documentation and praise for things like weight loss or gain, Wii Fit got players moving and interacting with the game in front of them in a completely different way than seen before. In a completely separate realm from bodily movement, sensory input introduces a new method of feeding a game information that incorporates the body beyond hand-eye coordination and mechanical precision. But what happens if you were to put the two together? Once a question of science fiction, virtual reality is now so accessible that 1 in 5 American adults had tried it at least once by 2020. VR is the ultimate sensory experience, seamlessly blending things like auditory and vocal inputs through surround sound and built-in microphones, visual presentations that completely obscure the world around you, and controllers that precisely track your movements both within space and at a technical or precise level. From movement games like Beat Saber, to horror games like Phasmophobia, or open-world adventures like The Elder Scrolls, VR technology brings the whole body into the game in a way completely separate from the keyboard and mouse models that video games are typically represented by. So we've talked about different ways that video games incorporate the body into their mechanics. But video games weren't always created with this goal in mind. A look at the brief history we outlined earlier shows just how disconnected players might have been from the inputs they were feeding computers and consoles. So why have video games taken the direction they have? Why did companies decide to break traditional mouse and keyboard or controller models with things like motion capture and sensory input? The most obvious answer is a theme recurrent in game studies when analyzing why developers and designers make the choices they do: because it increases immersion. Many video games' end goal is to create a virtual reality in some way or another, and so incorporating the body into play is one way of bridging the gap between simulated and real. In some cases, video games provide players with experiences they won't or can't experience in person, and so the greater the immersion, the more realistic the game and its mechanics feel, the greater the appeal. A skydiving simulator, for example, is much less scary when the trigger to jump is a physical step forward rather than the click of a mouse, and a horror game is made all the more terrifying when even breathing too loudly can aggro a monster onto your character. In Faye, Ginsburg, and Rapp's article Disability Worlds, they emphasize the impact that media worlds can have on people with disabilities, writing that media of all sorts are deeply implicated in the creation of a more inclusive sense of citizenship for non-normative social actors. Video games, after all, are simulated experiences, digital worlds of pretend made of zeros and ones, and so it follows that they should be accessible to everyone. But that is unfortunately not the case, even though disabled gamers make up about 20% of the entire gaming population. Controllers, keyboards, and mice requiring precise movement are not the most naturally accommodating devices to people with limited physical capabilities, and to those with sensory impairments, things like audio and visual cues like menu interfaces or dialogue can be impossible to pick up on. And so here's where the body comes into play. Through eye tracking, which simulates movement of a cursor or controller, as we spoke about before, auditory narration, or tactical sensations like vibrating controllers, people with disabilities are granted some degree of accommodation through designing games outside of the traditional box. We are, obviously, nowhere near being perfectly accommodating in the video game world, but by incorporating senses and inputs beyond the conception of the normal, abled gamer, more and more visual worlds are able to be explored and accessed. Perhaps what both of these answers incorporate is the breaking of expectations of what a video game can and should be by the developers and designers, who rely on sensory input as a method of innovation in their games. We already talked about smell and taste in terms of what's to come, but what else is there? How are video games going to continue to bridge the gap between the body and the digital? As video games grow and change alongside similarly advancing technology, the connection between body and game is only going to continue to deepen. Immersion has reached its peak 1,000 times. From surround sound to VR headsets to balance boards and controllers. How long until it's no longer a virtual, but a psychological simulation? We are already seeing research into what's to come. What if I told you that eye tracking software that we've touched on as a means of both increasing immersion and accessibility can also allow games with an artificial intelligence game engine insight into your very mind? A team of researchers have employed eye tracking software to reveal cognitive processes like emotions and choice in certain video game softwares. What happens when these AIs gain access to our other senses and bodily processes? How far will they be able to get into our heads? And as technology improves, how long until the idea of a console or a computer is completely obsolete? As inputs become simpler and simpler and technology continues to shrink, how close can games get to our body entirely? Technology like Neuralink and other cybernetic implants have already sought to blend the human body and the digital. How long until games follow suit? There's no way of knowing what's to come next, but by looking at the improvements we've already seen in the merging of body and video game, at the accessibility and immersion it provides, allowing a wider audience and a more interactive experience for everyone, we can get a glimpse at what the future will look like. And if looking at current trends is any indicator, the incorporation of the body, the idea of it as a controller, is not going away anytime soon. So the question is not if, but how technology will continue to incorporate us until there's potentially no body even left.